Okay, I think we can go ahead and start. Good evening. This is Keisha Rogers, and I want to thank you for joining us for our Promethean Action, Promethean Pact discussion. I'll be joined by Michael Stager. It is Monday, June 2nd, and I'm going to pretty much turn it right over to Michael. I just want to bring a couple of things to people's attention in terms of what we are in the middle of for this fight to save our republic. On Saturday, if you missed it, just in case you missed it, there was an extraordinary class and discussion that was given by Brian Lance and Tony Pappert, moderating that discussion there on the question of economic growth, the reality of economic growth right now. And this is what President Trump has been committed to. And the idea of what he has done to move toward a transformation for bringing about a new golden age in our nation of economic development starts with his commitment to put an end to these endless wars. Now, as will be discussed in some contexts here tonight, there are people who have done everything in their power to continue to push the United States and the world toward the brink of nuclear war, World War III. And we see this. Everybody, of course, is watching the little old lady from South Carolina, as has been known by the name of Lindsey Graham and others who are just determined that at all costs, we're going to continue to fund and back Ukraine and to get the United States and the world deeper and deeper into a confrontation with Russia. So we'll talk about that, but I think the most important thing is the question of what is the commitment of President Trump. He has committed to America first, to putting our nation back to work. We saw with the developments recently in his trip to Pittsburgh to restore our steel manufacturing, the jobs creation, what's being done under President Trump. These executive orders, as we've said, have to be made not just into executive orders, but be brought into law. And the key to that is the fight is going to be the American people continuing to recognize the pathway to economic growth, putting an end to these wars. And it's not just enough that we got President Trump and his team, J.D. Vance and others, elected in November, but we now have to make sure that President Trump's team is continued to be built up, his policies are put forward and passed by ensuring that the 2026 election is going to continue to back President Trump. And that means to get the right people in Congress and in positions of leadership backing President Trump and the warmongers and hawks and so forth out of office. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Michael so that he can give us a sense of how we start to think about the direction the American people have to participate in to move this decisive campaign forward. All right, Michael, you there?
Great, thanks, Keisha. So as many of us on this call understand, Trump came out of his inauguration on January 20th like a thoroughbred racehorse, well prepared, had the packages ready to go on the economy, on the border, on immigration, on the wars, on the negotiations. He deployed, as we all know, Steve Witkoff to Gaza, then to Moscow, then to Oman for the Iran negotiations, and Rome later. And there have been an ongoing series of initiatives in every area, from Liberation Day on the tariffs, the trade negotiations, the energy deployments, nuclear energy, and as Keisha said, Brian Lance's class on Saturday on Promethean Action should certainly be watched if you haven't, and you should send it to friends if you did, because people need to know the actual steps Trump is taking in the real world, not in the world of ideologies, not in the world of just political domestic footballs, but in real terms, not just talking points, not just things politicians do to campaign on later. They said they did something, they signed it, but nothing really happened. But a real sense of what Trump is doing with funding, with direction in terms of our infrastructure, our flight systems, our energy supply, our mining, our industry, our ports, our shipbuilding, our steel production. Big rally in Pittsburgh celebrating $14 billion investments. We're talking hundreds of billions and literally trillions of dollars of investments launched in the first first 100 days plus. At the same time, we have now seen that the enemy has kind of prepared its defensive lines. This was going to happen at some point. There was no way Trump was just going to get, ability to run rampant on the entire post-war neoliberal system. And so we've seen now in the courts, you saw this International Trade Court in New York. None of us probably knew that court even existed. Comes up and it deals with all trade laws. The administration's actually been looking to push all lawsuits on the tariffs into that court. It's a strange court. It's a bipartisan court. You have to have so many various people, party affiliation. But the main point is the people that were involved in supporting the lawsuit that was waged against Trump, which eventually included a number of states. But the New York Times released today, this involved the founder, Stephen Calabresi, of the Federalist Society, the most renowned institution for so-called conservative judges for the last 3 or 4 decades. So the founder of the most conservative legal society and think tank and general institution is signing on to with a leading libertarian who said the entire conservative movement right now is aligned. And what he means by that is the elite financial Washington, New York elite conservatives are aligned entirely against Trump's economic agenda right now. That's what one libertarian said, quoted by the Times. And they've got leading liberals. You've got Mukasey, who was George Bush's attorney general, signed on. This is a brief to the International Trade Court opposing Trump's tariffs as unconstitutional. And that court ruled that not only are the Liberation Day tariffs not based on an emergency, and maybe we could that one maybe has more room for negotiation, though the complete collapse and loss of our critical supply chains could certainly be an emergency, and certainly is when other emergencies hit. But the fentanyl crisis, which has killed over 500,000 Americans in the last 3 years, is undeniably an emergency. And this court struck down both as unconstitutional, abiding by these lawyers. So you have the founder of the Federalist Society, a Bush attorney general, a leading libertarian, and then the former dean of the Yale Law School, the neoliberal pedigree of all pedigrees, Harold Koh, also signing on. This is the entire deep state political establishment aligned, and that what they're aligned against is Trump reorganizing the global economic system, because that's what they're there to defend. They're just merely the Praetorian guards, well-paid lackeys, leporellos, and servants of a much higher level, old oligarchical structure that says, this is our territory. You are not, as a sovereign nation, as an elected leader by the plebeians of America, are you going to readjust the global economic system to benefit the large majority of those American citizens and many other, really billions of people around the world, the billions who are largely supporting ending globalization, ending cheap labor, ending slave labor, are not going to be the ones who dictate the economic system. We, the oligarchical few, are going to be the ones who determine this. And that's what these lawyers, that's who pays these lawyers' salaries. That's who it creates their firms. That's what gives them prestige, is that they work for that oligarchical interest. So That gives us a sense then why there is such, and Brian covered this a lot on Saturday, so I'm only going to briefly touch on it, why there is such a harangue around the deficit and what Trump's doing with the deficit, and we're not cutting Medicaid enough. So you've got a bunch of so-called economists and stockbrokers. Just, people often reference David Ricardo and comparative advantage in economics. David Ricardo was a stockbroker. That's what he was. He wasn't an economist. He didn't work in industry. He was a stockbroker, made money, and then decided to say, I know how the entire economy works. So you have similar things today, but it just shows you it's nothing new under the sun with this stuff. People screaming, there's going to be a huge deficit, there's going to be a huge deficit. One, there's no demonstration of that. People are screaming there's going to be huge inflation. No demonstration of that. I mean, maybe there will be on some of these questions. The deficit certainly seems to grow out of control. It kind of has a mind of its own. But people are screaming with no clear justification except, the Congressional Budget Office said so. But then what they're feeding is another group of people who are their paid lackeys in Congress saying, that's why we have to cut Medicaid more. That's why we've got to cut the resources of the plebeians. Now, no one's going to make an argue that these government programs aren't incredibly corrupt on some level. What Obama did with Medicaid, I mean, that's basically what Obamacare was like a massive expansion of government provided low-level, insurance. And then on top of that, he destroyed the economy. So you needed more Medicaid. But you've got these people then in Congress and the Republican Party screaming, we're going to cut Medicaid, knowing full well that if you sit there and scream like an idiot, the drunken town idiot, we've got to cut Medicaid, we've got to cut Medicaid, all that's going to be done is looped over and over and over and over again in the 2026 primary that the Democrats are going to, regardless if it's true or not, they're going to tell all of their voters they're literally cutting Medicaid and trying to kill you. That's what they're going to say. Now, certainly, most Americans support taking all illegals off these programs. We saw what happened in Boulder, Colorado. Trump said it. Biden's open border policies brought in terrorists. And here is a guy running some low-level terrorist action, burning old ladies with Molotov cocktails. Just insane. So most Americans support some of these basic reforms, but you have this operation to try to undermine Trump's domestic agenda, which is what? It's not an obsession over the debt. The debt is massive. It's not an obsession over the deficit, which has been crazy under Biden. And it can't be as bad as under Biden. It just can't be because of how Trump's going to spend and organize the government. But he's not obsessed over the government debt. He's not obsessed over cutting Medicaid, which of course is excessive. I mean, Obama just drove increasing numbers, specifically of the blue-collar MAGA voter that Obama despised, and Obama's, network and grouping despised those working-class Americans with the gun racks in the truck, and they don't like arugula, don't eat it every day. Obama despised these people, and he plunged them onto Medicaid. So Trump's not obsessed with cutting Medicaid, especially not for hardworking Americans who have been driven into poverty by the insane economic policies. Trump's agenda is growth. We've got to grow the economy. And you grow the economy not by just printing more money and getting the stock market to go up, just as some people now say, just make it go. We have an economy that is make it go up, make the stock market go up. It's just the number. Where Trump's approach is real physical economy. So he's got this faction, these elite lawyers looking to undermine his trade negotiations and reorganizing the global system. Then you've got this bandits inside the Republican Party who are obsessed over the deficit, Medicaid, people like Ron Johnson, who seems to be a decent MAGA senator, sharp and decent on COVID, who is insisting on an obsession over those characteristics. Now, why is this so insane? Because the Republican Party has been brainwashed by its donor class to be the party of the minority. It does not intend, and this is the entire problem with the libertarian ideology, that they're more concerned about the ideology than they are about solving the nation's problems. They'd rather be able to genuflect to their ideological set of rules than be able to solve the real problems in the country. How do you solve real problems? You build a coherent regime. You pull together a majority, a supermajority that governs the country. This is what Franklin Roosevelt did. He won in 32. By 34, he had a governing majority in both chambers. That's how Donald Trump thinks. That's how J.D. Vance thinks. That's how the entire Trump White House thinks. They're going into these midterms with $600 billion on hand. They plan to have $1 trillion on hand. They intend to pull this thing together based on their physical accomplishments and their growth perspective. And so we've got to have a sense, first and foremost, that this is a full-on war. It is a war over letting the United States economy be the point of principle or the proof of principle for what a global economic reorganization looks like. That we're going to reorganize the global economic system premised on the reorganization of the US economy. This is what Franklin Roosevelt did. This is what Lincoln initiated during the Civil War. And Roosevelt said, we're now going to implement it. We're first going to regenerate that industrial economy that's been lost throughout the 1920s and during World War I. We're going to reindustrialize it. And then once we do that, we're going to reorganize the global economy and global system around nation states that have the tools at hand to industrialize. Trump is thinking the exact same way. So we should have a sense of, one, the fights at hand domestically and the role all of us are going to play in making sure that the American people, the people we're talking with, the people in our communities, have a sense that this is going to be the fight for the midterms. Those midterm fights start now. The first 100 days is done. The defenses of the enemy are now established. We see the problems within the judiciary and how they're trying to undermine Trump. We see the insanity of the Democrats, but they're in disarray. They have no plan or program. All they're going to do is lie to the American people. And the only way those Democratic Party lies are going to work, and the only way they've ever worked, is that they've got a bunch of dumb wooden Republicans who sit there for congressional districts or state or Senate fights or governor fights saying, we've got to cut taxes and cut Medicaid and cut the budget. That's the problem. As if somehow you're running an accounting firm rather than running a country where the livelihood of your voters depends upon real growth, not fiscal responsibility. Not that anyone should be fiscally irresponsible, but we are not trying to reorganize a manufacturing firm. We are trying to complete a political revolution of the most powerful and important country in the world. And until you complete that revolution, you can't clean up the dust bunnies on the wood boards of your hallways. You've got to actually pull together a viable regime committed, undeniably committed to the majority voters' interests. And that means the working class, the exact people that Trump targeted in 2024 and won. And we've got to make that clear. That's got to be the clarion message. Now, as we've talked a lot about on this call, a big part of Trump's building this new economic system, this new global system, so that the United States has the ability to run wild, is to shut down these wars. And what we've seen over the weekend was a major escalation. Now, ironically, even though there was this insane escalation by Kiev, I'm sure you've all heard of it. So in summary, they launched like 115, 120 different drones, these small quadcopter plastic toy drones with various RPGs or explosive devices. It was a well-planned operation of like a year and a half. So Zelensky says, Zitler, and they may have destroyed up to 12 different planes with a $7 billion price tag. Those are the kind of moderate estimates, approximations that people are providing. So Ukraine says 40 planes, the Russians say 2 or 3, others are putting it around 12. It's hard to say exactly. But they targeted the strategic bomber fleet, so Tu-95 long-range bombers and a couple of other planes that are part of that strategic bombing fleet, or part of the strategic triad, nuclear-capable bombers. These are left out on runways, just like they are in the United States, in Russia, because that's part of maintaining a kind of a stability for both Russia and American defense sectors. That we can have surveillance, we know their bombers are there, we know how many are there. So if all of a sudden all of those bombers were missing, you would be able to know and open up a line of communication what's happening. So they're left out and vulnerable in some sense. These were in the far north, on the border of Finland and Murmansk, out in Siberia and Irkutsk of Russia. So it wasn't even near the front lines or the boundaries between Russia and Ukraine. That's all pretty intense. At the same time, no lives were lost, not directly by the attacks. There were some incidental life lost. But there were also two railway bridges which were bombed and detonated, sabotaged. That did kill, I think, between 7 and 10 people in Russia on Saturday. So a series of escalations. Russia apparently retaliated with like a 400 drone and combined with cruise and ballistic missile attacks on various parts of Ukraine in response to these attacks by Ukraine. So it's a war. But at the same time, reports have come out that because of Trump's instigation, despite the efforts of Kiev to disrupt this, to not meet, to not have negotiations, to try to provoke Russia, this entire attack was meant to do one thing. One, maybe to get some sensational media so people like Lindsey Graham can say, see, Ukraine can get out there and win. Russia's about to launch a major offensive. We've got to back Ukraine up. Like, we've got to plunge the United States into a World War III with Russia. If we don't do that now, we're going to lose our chance. And Lindsey Graham doesn't know what he would do if he's going to meet his maker and can't say he started World War III. So besides the sensational media coverage and the ability for Lindsey Graham and Zelensky to tout their toughness, who God knows what Lindsey Graham and Zelensky do when they're together. Probably play the piano, Zelensky style or something. Part of it is to provoke, besides the sensational nature, is to provoke Russia into reacting. To get Russia to show that it's really not willing to have negotiations. Because that's part of this thing. Zelensky and the Ukrainians want to convince Donald Trump and the United States that Russia is unwilling to negotiate. They're really just a bunch of Nazi terrorists that have no regard for civilization at all. But that's not happening. Rubio called Foreign Minister Lavrov, so the Secretary of State called the Russian Foreign Minister, expressed condolences over the loss of lives, over the bridges that were sabotaged and blown up, and they had a discussion about ongoing negotiations. It's not clear entirely everything they talked about, but that's what's reported. And then today, the defense minister of Ukraine met with the deputy defense minister of Russia. Besides having about an hour-and-a-half meeting as negotiating teams, just the two of them met for 2.5 hours by themselves before they then ended up in the official negotiations in Istanbul. So Trump has accomplished bringing these guys together now for the second time. There's probably a third meeting planned for sometime later in June. They're going to do a major prisoner release, perhaps the largest done. They just did 1,000 prisoners exchanged. They're going to do another one. This will include all of the injured and sick and all of the prisoners under 25. They're also going to release, the Russians are going to release 6,000 Ukrainian dead, and they're going to create ceasefires. And this gives you a sense of the grim nature of this war. They're going to do a limited ceasefire along certain parts of the front, where the Russians will then deliver the Ukrainian dead because they are rotting in the summer heat. And there is a concern for the spread of epidemics. So the Russians are obviously conquering territory, and they're marching past dead Russian dead Ukrainian soldiers. And they're like, we need to get these things out of here. The fastest way would be to get them just to the Ukrainian side for Christian burial. So that's what the Russian negotiator, Medinsky, laid out in a short press conference today. He also said he was asked in what language were the negotiations held. And he said, I'll give you three guesses. The reporter guessed Russian, and he said, you got it on the first try. So it just gives you a sense of the flavor and ironies, both of as intense as those escalations of attacks were, the level of ongoing negotiations. Because if Putin is anything, he is a master strategic thinker. He's got huge pressure. What that attack by the Ukrainians did was inflame perhaps even a majority of the Russian people, but certainly very loud voices on social media for whatever size of the population it was, which were screaming for far more aggressive attacks on Ukraine because that it outrages them that these little pricks in Ukraine think that they can win a war against Russia when Russia has basically been with the gloves on for the entire time. One, to preserve Ukraine, to not fully destroy it, but also to respect it as like a brother Slavic people, intimately connected to the people of Russia historically, which has always been Putin's argument. But Putin knows that besides just those reasons, that what Trump is offering is a way out, not just for Russia. He knows it's also a way out for Trump because nations, every nation, our nation, Russia, India, even China, for all of its petulant kind of complaining, which about the trade negotiations, any nation, and those are perhaps the four largest and most powerful, all of them need to escape from this oligarchical madness. They've all been manipulated and played. They're all being sucked into various conflicts and wars, from terrorism to economic crises to, potential revolts within their countries. They've got to pull this thing together. They know it. The same is true with the Gulf countries. They know that if they don't pull a deal with Iran together, if they don't pull a deal together regarding Gaza, this world that we're living in today, within the blink of an eye, could blow up into a massive global conflict. And that would mean complete destruction of supply chains for all countries, a complete energy crisis and emergency, at a time when we're so dependent on electronic communications, right? AI and computers are going to need energy. That's the one thing everybody's figured out. All of a sudden, energy gets shut down. All of those computer systems shut down. Flight systems shut down. Right? The kind of crisis that sets in if you end up into a global conflict is unlike anything anybody has ever imagined. I mean, they were still using horses in World War I. Not much of our country still did not have, maybe not a majority, but maybe a majority of land area still in our country did not have electrification by the start of World War II. So all of these countries realize we've got to escape this. And what people like Lindsey Graham, people like these lawyers like Stephen Calabresi, this oligarchical crowd, like Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, who said we are facing the greatest threat to the UK's existence that we have since like World War II. And he's saying Russia is the threat. And we've got to mobilize massive defense spending, massive restructuring of the government budget. But Keir Starmer is collapsing. They are looking at what we saw in Boulder over the weekend, times 1,000, times 1,000,000 in terms of multicultural decay and a lack of civic order, a lack of social coherence. There's no mission, there's no direction. There's an economic breakdown, and there's total incompetence and obeisance to an oligarchical agenda, which is more committed to nuclear war and war with Russia than it is addressing even just basic, straightforward issues. The same is true, but the situation I think is more complicated in Iran and Gaza. Hamas, as far as I know, and Tony or someone else on this call could correct me, Hamas has yet to sign on to the 60-day ceasefire that's been proposed, even though Qatar and other groups in the Gulf, who have been the biggest supporters of Hamas, have insisted they sign it. They are not signing. It gives you a sense that Hamas really is a British intelligence concoction. And it was George W. Bush and Dick Cheney which gave the Gazans the right to vote. And who did they vote for? Hamas. They voted for them once. And now, 18 plus years later, this grouping is somehow leading the negotiations for so-called conflict and war. It really is just a monstrosity of neoliberalism. So we'll see what happens with Gaza. But it needs to stop. And Trump has made that very clear. And the Gulf countries are directly involved. But you have this globalist tendency. Iran is probably hung up far more by American domestic insanity. Trump needs, and the American people need, this package that Trump has put forward, which will fix our flight system, upgrade it by like $40 billion package to upgrade our flight system to a modern technology. Energy questions, tax questions for working class people, government, write-offs for major investments. A lot of this money planning to come in is waiting to make sure that they have the tax write-off so they can dump in huge amounts of money this year. And you have people like Lindsey Graham sitting on the budget committee in the Senate threatening to blow up the entire domestic agenda and the entire operations of government, along with other kind of ideologues like Ron Johnson or complete sellouts and zombies like Mitch McConnell. So Trump is trying to work with an incredibly challenging environment. I had a friend today tell me, look, Trump should go to the American people. He should hold an evening address. He should go to the American people and tell them what he's confronting, what he's trying to do, and call the American people to his side. Now, that probably is not a bad idea, but it's also something Trump will only do once he's exhausted the ability to work with what he has right now. Because Trump remains confident and he's always bullish. He can get done what needs to get done. So, like, the situation though is just incredibly tense. Because the situation in Iran, the situation in Gaza, and the situation in Russia are threatening world war. And that's why what we just saw by Zelensky in Kiev is worth covering in depth, as hopefully you got some sense of it. I'm sure you already had some idea. But it comes back to what we've been discussing here now for a number of weeks, which is we've got to be able to pull together a new global system. And it's going to be premised on two factors. One, especially that negotiation, the crux of it is the negotiation with Russia. And the second is the kind of economic shift in the United States domestically, where you have a coherent regime operating on physical metrics of real growth, real industry, real scientific breakthroughs, the colonization of Mars, a moon base. Musk laid out a remarkable picture of space exploration over the weekend. But what I want to touch on here is, how do we help pull together the political coalition domestically in these midterm elections? How do we change the script? How do we prevent the Republican establishment and all their vacuous campaign programs and consultants from dominating the discourse when Trump and his agenda need to continue to resonate in an even clearer form in elections that are always can be more challenging because the leading figure, Trump, is not there compelling people's votes. You've got to see him express. You've got to have 1,000 Trumps in all the counties of the country expressing what Trump, the leadership, the clarity, the polemics that he was. Well, one of the things came up, and so I just want to use this as maybe as a point of reference. In these trade negotiations, Trump was asked, what happens if, children's toys are going to go up in price? And Trump responded, well, then the little girl will only get $2 instead of 30. And you're saying, you mean she's not going to be able to get 28 other dolls? The $2 are going to become that expensive? And Trump said something like, we just don't need so much cheap stuff. She's going to get $2. That's enough. Um, so this became a major talking point. And all of Trump's cabinet was asked, well, what do you say to the little girl that's only going to get $2? Well, Steve Besant, the Treasury Secretary, was asked this question. And he said, well, I think you can tell that little girl you're only going to get $2, but you're going to have a future that's better than what your parents had. You're going to have a nation that's viable and growing. Now, that's a good answer. Steve Besant's a sharp guy. The problem is that's not the person who has to give up the sacrifices. That really isn't a sacrifice. Kids probably do have too many toys today, but it's not a question of that. It's a question of what everyone's assuming in that scenario is, well, everything I have will remain the same. All my stocks, all my investments, all my retirement, all my housing value, all these things will just continue to remain permanent. But yeah, some consumer items may be shortage a little bit less. Now, I'm not saying the answer is to fundamentally change people's stock investments and housing values. But we all know that the way this is going to work and the quality of citizenry we're going to have is to ask all members of society to say, how much are you willing to give up? Or how much are you not willing to give up if you know for certain that we're at a critical existential point in the nation's existence in world history? When the housing bubble crashed in 2007-8, the proposal we made was to restructure the mortgages at the lower housing values, to freeze all mortgages, to let the housing prices come down, and then to restructure the mortgages. Let the prices come down. There was a hot bubble. Let the prices come down and then just restructure the debt that's owed based on the actual value, because everybody had been schemed. Some people might really benefit from that. Some people might have been injured by that. But in general, it was strategic. It was the kind of that middle pathway. It made sense. Instead, we've printed $8 trillion in new cash, and we reinflated all of these values. And everybody's made gobs of money. Even people younger than me, people in their 20s and 30s, are multimillionaires over things like Bitcoin. And what Trump has been doing is going to Saudi Arabia, going to Qatar, going to UAE, going to these various countries, especially those which have large petrodollars, dollar reserves from oil sales, and saying he's applied a national credit policy to bringing these dollars, which are offshore in essence, or just into financial investments, and he wants to bring them back in. Trump's even talking about taxing remittances, taxing foreign investments of passive financial investments like stocks and bonds and other equities. So this is in the big, beautiful bill. I mean, this has got Wall Street freaked. But what Trump is saying is, look, move your money into physical investments. We want national credit going into industrial production, private companies, AI, manufacturing, whatever, because Trump knows that once you have those private firms operating, you have a foundation for the investments in public investments into basic infrastructure. The counties do, the states do, the local regions do, and the federal government will have increasing tax revenue and the ability to lower debt, extend new debt, and build up the nation's infrastructure on a broad scale. That's what Trump sees. Pull in foreign investments massively into these areas, pull companies like NVIDIA, like Apple, to make these investments. That's a far different perspective. He's taking that $8 trillion in cash, which has been multiplied numerous times by various transactions. And he's saying we've got to pour that back into the physical development of the country. It's a national credit policy without having a national bank. And they're looking at how to set up a national type bank that will vector that type of dynamic. But the question at core about what Trump is doing is a sense of sacrifice. And the sacrifice is not just what the little girl will give up, $28. Will she get 30 or will she get 2? It's a sense of, look, we've got to pull this together. We've got to make sure this works. And the government has to make it clear we are going to make sure the livelihood of our citizens are there. Does that mean massive stock numbers? Well, we had those under Joe Biden. And everybody thought they were probably a stock market genius under Biden. But it didn't give us any meaning or sense of hope or longevity of the country. And so it is a question of continuing to ask people. It's not just financial resources, but I'm not saying, and many of you on this call have already given tons. If you're in dialogue with us, you've probably already done a ton. But it is the question that you have then the moral ability to go out and tell others, look, we've got to continue to ask our own generation, as well as the younger generations, to make the sacrifices to pull the country together, that we are on a cliff's edge. We've pulled back from that. We've taken a step back from the deep plunge. We didn't put in Kamala Harris. But that doesn't mean we've escaped what could be a kind of an avalanche or massive erosion, mudslide into the abyss. To pull this together requires a kind of devotion. And what Americans have lost in this culture of materialism and consumerism for decades, with the sexual obsessions of the 1960s, and which are tied then to a lot of kind of obsessions over violence of the 1960s. And these are the kinds of axioms that dominate the Democratic Party today. But what's been lost to the culture as a whole is that where great meaning is found in those even greater senses of sacrifice. This is what has revived a kind of patriotism in Russia, the fight for Russia's existence. That's what we saw emerge from the American people. It was like the scales fell from their eyes, like when Paul, when he finally makes it to Damascus, and he's blind, and he finally is able to wash his face, and the scales fall off his eyes, and he can see. The scales fell off the American people's eyes in 2020. They began to see their society for what it was. They saw the corruption of the medical institutions, of the media, the incompetence of so-called academic or government experts. It all became clear as day. So even people that voted for Joe Biden in 2020 are today leading Trump outspoken Trump supporters. Because even if they were still not clear what the situation was, that moment, and then that election steal, which was so blatant, began to set in. A momentum was created from that moment. That momentum is undeniably the most powerful factor we have of pulling together and saving and rescuing our civilization. There is growing, rampant discussion of the inevitable civil war and breakdown of the West. When you look at cultures like Britain or France today, the big Paris soccer team won the big European championship. And there's been nonstop, massive riots over the weekend because of it. Just huge riots. They won the World Cup in 1998. There was like a celebration of love and joy down the Champs-Élysées. 25 years plus later, and it is total bedlam. Just criminal destruction, rage, panic, and complete disregard for the society and civilization that the young people are a part of. And this is largely to do with uncontrolled migration and other factors. It's also a lack of industrial economy and production. What you brought these people into was a decaying economic culture. The same could be said true about many cities in the United States. So if we want to sit in the tension of how dark and scary it isn't simply the world wars or the breakout of world war. That could certainly happen. It is this kind of deeper cultural rot that has real roots right here in our own country, right here in all of our big cities, right here in all of our universities where they continue to train and deploy these people from an ideological standpoint. Now, we've done a lot. Trump has done a lot in his first 100 days. We aren't going to course correct that quickly. This is going to require participation in a war that is going to be decisive today. It is undeniable that J.D. Vance, who is now the finance chairman of the RNC and the leading candidate for president in 2028, if he maintains that, will have a massive head start versus any Democrat. They've lost the majority appeal. They are a minority party there to disrupt and to deny. But that can be very effective in midterm elections. So J.D. Vance is going to be directly involved in running the midterms. And what they're going to continue to look for and compel from us as citizens is a sense of that devotion and that sacrifice. It isn't about what the little girl gives up. It's about what her mom and dad and the grandparents, even at this late stage in life. But it's like, well, what's her future? What are her children's future going to be like? Whatever we have to do, as long as there's a coherent battle plan, as long as there's a clear sense. And that's the kind of message Trump can come out with his supporters. That's the kind of message he took to Pittsburgh. That's what kind of message we have to take out and resonate within the American people. We've taken a step back, but this thing can blow up. It can blow up rapidly if we don't keep the pressure up. The best way of preventing an enemy from unleashing chaos is to keep them on their heels, to keep pushing forward, to keep recognizing the gains we've made, and to accelerate those as quickly as possible. There is, without doubt, the world is watching this political contest in the United States. It will define what happens in Europe. It's already had an impact. Poland just voted for a conservative president. That's a good victory. The German regime shifted from its complacency to change its migration policies. There are potentials, but it's not just Europe. It's the Americas. It's much of Africa descending into chaos. South Africa has been in a 17-year period of total destruction. This was the leading industrial economy of Africa, and it's now a 17-year total destruction, basically under the Obama international regime. And so there are major factors that can blow up, and we've covered much of the rest of the world already. So we should just sit in the tension, but knowing the kinds of gains we've made and the kinds of sacrifices, to me, when you think of it, we were talking about the sacrifices of like a 6 or 7-year-old girl or 4 or 5-year-old girl. It's like that really, like Scott Bessent is the guy. What Scott Bessent should be saying is, I'm willing to give up 28 out of 30 of my resources. I'll give up 90% of my incredible affluence to make sure this country survives. Now, we all don't have the resources of Scott Bessent, but that's the kind of appeal. You know, it's the old parable about the woman that has no coins except just a few small tokens, and she gives that to the box, to the tithe at church, to the temple. That is the real expression of a devotion to God, of a devotion to one's nation. And it's really going to be that. It is that emotional quality. This isn't just an appeal for you to give us money. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that at core, we have to be willing to make that case to every American this coming period. And we have to make sure we hold the Republicans in Congress accountable, that they have to have a commitment to the country, not to their ideology. Yes, we have to deal with the budget. Yes, we have to deal with the debt. Yes, we have to deal with the deficit. But right now, you've got to get out there and compel the American people to get behind you in a full majority. We've got to march in a fundamentally different direction, not tweak a few buttons on the control panel. We've got to overhaul the entire control system in a completely different direction. And if we do that in the United States politically, we are going to see a fundamentally different freak out from the enemy, and we are going to see an entirely different potential. If we secure these kinds of midterms and we secure that kind of fight from the American people, we are going to secure a completely different potential in the world as a whole. So I want to end on that note. And Keisha, throw it back to you and see if people have some thoughts and questions tonight.